Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jim Hodges, a partner in the McGuire Woods Law Firm and president of McGuire Woods Consulting. For the past few months, we've spent most of our time advising clients on the complicated and ever-changing issues related to the COVID-19 virus. Today's webinar is designed to provide insight into the unique issues facing higher education institutions. We're pleased to have an outstanding group of presenters who are working with colleges and universities to keep faculty and staff, students and guests healthy and safe. Now I will turn the program over to my colleague Harrison Marshall, who will serve as moderator of the program.
Thank you, Governor Hodges. As this audience knows all too well, the challenges facing higher education today are unprecedented. Figuring out how to operate remotely felt like a big challenge a couple of months ago, but looking back on it now, it seems pretty simple when compared to the challenges of reopening. We have a panel of experts here today who graduated from these schools that are now on your screen. We noticed yesterday from the registrations that most of these schools are represented here today. We want you to know that we, your alumni, are pulling for you and also for your colleagues from all the other schools attending today's webinar. Here are our presenters. You'll first hear from Laura Fornash and Scott Freen of McGuire Woods Consulting. Laura is the former Secretary of Education for the Commonwealth of Virginia and has served in leadership roles at 2 higher education institutions, including 20 years at Virginia Tech. Scott is the co-lead of the McGuire Woods Consulting Education team, working on policy matters in Congress with the United States Department of Education and at state legislatures and administrations. They will talk about some of the funding that is currently available to assist in reopening and will also provide insights on additional governmental support that's under discussion. John McDonald is a partner in the labor and employment practice at McGuire Woods. He is the co-lead of the firm's COVID-19 response team. His primary focus in recent weeks has been on helping employers navigate the complex legal issues relating to reopening. He will talk about the sorts of claims that, unfortunately, are already emerging relating to employee and personal safety, and will provide guidance on how to prepare now for those claims in order to reduce your institution's vulnerability to those claims. We'll next hear from Justin Belante and Deborah Dean of BioIQ. For over a decade, BioIQ has been a national leader in healthcare engagement, analytics, testing, and care navigation for diseases such as cancer, diabetes, kidney disease, and infectious diseases. They work with dozens of health plans representing over 70% of insured lives in the U.S., as well as large employers. Since the advent of the coronavirus pandemic, BioIQ has deployed that experience to help employers, health plans, and governmental entities fight COVID-19. Okay. Justin is the co-founder and CEO of BioIQ. His bachelor's and master's degrees are from Case Western Reserve in materials engineering, and he left his PhD at UC Santa Barbara to join BioIQ in 2005. Debbie is the Chief Analytics and Technology Officer at BioIQ. In prior jobs, she has had experience in clinical trial management, informatics, and quality management. At BioIQ, she focuses on deploying technological innovations to produce better healthcare outcomes for customers and their employees. Justin and Debbie are going to discuss how universities should go about developing testing and contact tracing protocols, taking into account the varying degrees of risk that you have in different campus activities. Our final presenter today is Doug Gwynn, Vice President of Thompson Industrial Services. Thompson provides a wide array of cleaning services to companies in a variety of industries. Each industry has its own cleaning challenges, and they change from time to time as products and processes evolve. And so Thompson's business model is to constantly develop new solutions to new problems. In the COVID-19 space, Thompson works with companies, schools, and military installations to develop cleaning and sanitizing protocols. Doug has 28 years of experience in chemical engineering and manufacturing, including work in food processing operations where safety and cleanliness are particularly important. Doug will discuss the importance of developing a cleaning plan based on the best current guidance so that you can limit your institution's liability. If you have questions as we go along, please type them in the chat box. We have an ambitious agenda, but anticipate having time at the end to respond to your questions. If we run out of time, we'll respond to your questions individually after the webinar. And so now I turn the microphone over to Laura.
Thanks, Harrison. I'm honored to be with such a distinguished group today as we navigate these unprecedented times and challenges. As everyone will remember, the CARES Act passed Congress at the end of March and directs $2 trillion to provide assistance to taxpayers and families, expand unemployment insurance, a retention tax credit for employers, and hundreds of billions in loans and grants to small and large businesses. The CARES Act contains several provisions related to education that we'll discuss today. The U.S. Education Department received $30.9 billion, of which $30.75 billion will go directly to states, local school divisions, and institutions of higher education to help schools, students, teachers, and families with the immediate needs related to coronavirus. There are 3 primary funds that were created to support education as part of this funding: the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, Elementary and Secondary Education School Emergency Relief Fund, and the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund. I will be referring specifically to the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund, while Scott will be speaking about the Governor's Emergency Education Fund in a few minutes. The Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund accounts for $14.5 billion and provides funding to public, private, and for-profit institutions. The funds are formula-driven to institutions based on 2 factors. 75% of the funds will be awarded to higher education institutions based on each institution's share of FTE enrollment of Pell Grant recipients who were not enrolled exclusively in distance learning programs prior to the coronavirus emergency, relative to the total FTE enrollment of such individuals in all higher education institutions. 25% of the funds will be awarded to institutions based on these institutions' FTE enrollment of students who were not Pell Grant recipients and were not enrolled exclusively in online programs prior to the coronavirus emergency relative to the total FTE of such individuals in all higher education institutions. 50% of the funds to institutions must go directly for expenses related to the disruption of campus operations due to COVID-19. Institutions have the responsibility of determining how grants will be distributed to students, how the amount of each student grant is calculated, and the development of any instructions or directions that are provided to students about the grant. The Department of Education reiterates in many of its communications that these funds must go directly to students and are for expenses related to the disruption of campus operations due to coronavirus, including eligible expenses under a student's cost of attendance, such as food, housing, course materials, technology, healthcare, and childcare. The remaining 50% must be used by the institution for COVID-19 related expenses. And on the next slide, I'd like to talk a little bit about what institutions are doing with these slides. Again, the Department of Education has been fairly broad in what institutions can use their institutional portion of the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund for. They basically reference for any costs associated with significant changes to the delivery of instruction due to the coronavirus. I would note that the FAQ document provided by USDOE does specifically mention that funds cannot be used for payment to contractors for the provision of pre-enrollment activities, including marketing and advertising, endowments, or capital outlays associated with facilities related to athletics, secretarial instruction, or religious worship. I've included a few of the primary areas the USDOE mentions in its guidance around how these dollars can be used. The first of which is technology. Institutions may use the funds to purchase equipment or software to pay for online licensing fees, pay for internet service to enable students to transition to distance learning. They may also use the funds to be reimbursed for computers or other equipment that is purchased for students. There is also a number of instructional costs that we know institutions are also experiencing, and the funds for the institution can be used to pay for per student fees that go to third-party service providers, including online program management companies for each additional student using the distance learning platform or learning management system as a result of the transition to online learning. The instructions were also updated to provide for the reimbursement of fee refunds. This was a big question early on when the CARES Act was passed. Institutions do have the ability to reimburse themselves for refunds that may have been provided to students for such things like room, board, tuition, and other fees as a result of significant changes to the delivery of instruction due to the coronavirus. The instructions also specifically reference the ability of institutions to provide additional emergency aid grants. So similar to the 50% that was allocated to institutions for students, this money can be used for an additional emergency aid grant that students at your institutions may have. We know that the institutions have other costs associated with the impact of coronavirus, including the purchase of PPE and other supplies, costs related to cleaning, contact tracing, and testing. And I know many states are looking at other areas of the CARES Act funding that's been provided directly to states to support some of these expenditures incurred as a result of the public health emergency. I will now turn it over to Scott to talk about how states are supporting colleges and universities and what further action Congress may take.
Great, thanks, Laura. I'm going to cover two slides, and the first of which is around the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, which Laura's already noted. I'll talk a little bit about state legislatures and some of the things that we're seeing already post the CARES Act passage, and then I'll get into some other opportunities that higher ed institutions have relative to the COVID-19 expenses. So first, the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, sometimes referred to as the GEER Fund, provided $3 billion in funding to governors that they could use at their discretion for K-12 schools and higher education institutions. Congress really intended this money to be used for states to fill any needs that the K-12 or the higher education fund didn't cover via formula. States are receiving anywhere between $4.4 million in a state like Vermont and $355 million in a state like California, based off the funding formula. There's plenty of flexibility in these funds, and most states are working through their allocations now. We do have some examples of what we're hearing, and some states that are using the money exclusively for higher education institutions, such as New Jersey, where they're making their $68.8 million available to post-secondary institutions to be used as emergency assistance grants as they work through the COVID virus. In terms of state legislative actions, the coronavirus pandemic is causing budget shortfalls all across the country. At the height of the pandemic, at least 25 states had postponed or suspended their legislatures. Over the last few weeks, we're seeing more states resume their sessions, including Alabama, California, Colorado, Delaware, Illinois, Louisiana, Massachusetts, Michigan, Mississippi, New Jersey, and Ohio, and more expected over the next several weeks. Some states, such as Virginia, Florida, and South Carolina, are planning to return for special sessions to address the coronavirus-related legislation and to mitigate state budgets later this summer or fall. As it relates to higher education specifically, we know that many bills have already been introduced related to higher education and the coronavirus pandemic. Topics include so far refunds and reimbursements, emergency preparedness, appropriations, and financial aid. One state has already passed a bill in Maryland that requires public institutions of higher education to submit an outbreak response plan to the Maryland Department of Health before August 1 of each year, starting next. The last topic on this slide is around additional federal dollars that are available under the CARES Act. The Coronavirus Relief Fund, which is really a state flexibility fund, was directed to cities and governors for additional use of expenditures incurred during the coronavirus pandemic. It's a $150 billion pot of money in all that states, territories, and tribal governments, ranging from $1.25 billion in some of the smallest states to upwards of $15 billion in California. The guidelines for this funding may only be used to cover necessary expenditures that were not accounted for in the budget and were recently approved as of March 27th and incurred between March 1 and December 30th, 2020. One example of what we've seen already in states on this specific pot of money is in North Carolina, who received $4.4 billion under the Coronavirus Relief Fund. And of that, $1.5 billion through the legislature was already used to fund some higher education needs, including $90 million to higher education specifically, such as its community college, its UNC flexibility funding, assistance for private colleges as well. The CARES Act, in addition, has $100 million for Project SERVE, which is a program that stands for the School Emergency Response to Violence. They use that money to ensure that K-12 institutions and higher education institutions could respond to the immediate needs of coronavirus and its effect on students. In addition to allowable uses of Project SERVE, the CARES Act will allow schools to use these monies for cleaning and disinfecting, as well as assisting with the costs related to counseling and distance learning. Finally, on the last slide, one of the things that I wanted to make sure that we mentioned today are some of the things that we're seeing relative to Congress and some next steps. So most of you probably saw on May 15th, the House Democrats led by Speaker Nancy Pelosi passed the HEROES Act. It was a $3 trillion bill, larger than the CARES Act, providing $500 billion to states, $1.5 billion for things like the homework gap, $4 billion for emergency home technology, and $90 billion for the State Fiscal Stabilization Fund. And just as a quick note, the $90 billion in the State Fiscal Stabilization Fund is about 3 times more than we saw in CARES, which would essentially replenish the K-12, the higher ed, and the governor's funds that we just spoke of. As you've probably seen in the media, the Senate Republicans have no plans to pass the HEROES Act. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has suggested that another relief bill is probable, and it should take shape in the coming weeks. There's a moving target right now of passage sometime around the July 4th recess. He's already signaled support for liability protections for businesses and additional relief for state and local government. To what extent education will be funded, I think, is still a question. There have been some conversations, however, around liability protections relative to coronavirus as college leaders have weighed in on the reopening of campuses this fall. Senate Help Committee Chairman Lamar Alexander has already signaled his support for this move, which ACE, the American Council on Education, and other higher education groups just sent a letter yesterday to the Hill acknowledging their support for it as well. Finally, one thing that came about yesterday is the Senate Help Committee is planning on having a hearing next Thursday titled COVID-19 Going Back to College Safely. The expected topics that we are planning on seeing are strategy for COVID-19 diagnostic and serology testing, plans to isolate students discovered to have the virus or have been exposed to it, implementation of social distancing guidelines in coordination and discussions with state and local public health officials. Witnesses so far include Mitch Daniels from Purdue University, Christina Paxson from Brown University, Logan Hampton from Lane College, and Dr. George Benjamin, who's the Executive Director of the American Public Health Association. We do know that the hearing, while it will be live, will also be live streamed. So that's it for me. Hopefully we've covered what we've seen so far relative to the funds that the Department of Education is working with, as well as what we might expect in the coming weeks and months. So that's it for me. Let me hand it over to John McDonald, who will talk about the legal issues around institutions reopening. John?
Thanks, Scott. Appreciate that. As everyone can probably imagine, the idea of talking about legal issues surrounding reopening in 10 minutes is just not going to happen. What I want to focus on, rather, is what are we seeing right now for the legal claims that are already being made related to COVID-19 exposure, what we expect to be seeing in the coming months for legal claims, and then kind of end with some, I hope, proactive tips that everyone can take away from this to help put every institution in a better place to deal with those legal claims that will come no matter what we all do. I think to set the stage a little bit for the legal claims, it might be helpful to share with you kind of some statistics of where we are. As of yesterday, there have been over 2,324 cases filed in federal and state courts related to COVID-19. As it relates to higher education, there have been 102 cases reported, and out of those, the vast majority, over 90 of them, related to refund requests and people asking for their tuition or other fees back because of closures in the spring semester. The other big category we're seeing is obviously in the employment context and just general liability. In those areas, the cases really focus around claims that an individual was exposed and contracted COVID-19 because of being in the workplace, as well as discrimination, ADA, leave, and FMLA-related claims. I think before we jump into the actual types of claims and some advice about those, I do think there is some major theme or major themes that you can take away as you plan for reopening and bringing students back to campus. And first of all, change, be prepared and react. The guidance that we are seeing coming from the CDC, from OSHA, and from state and local health departments is constantly changing. And because your legal liability in a large sense rests on or will be driven by whether you've complied with the current guidance, everyone needs to stay abreast of what's coming out of the officials, whether in Washington or in your states, so that you can maintain and put forth that you have been vigilant in complying and adapting to whatever those changes are. And secondly, it goes, I think, without saying that one size does not fit all when it comes to preparing for and responding to the legal issues that will be faced as you bring students back to campus. You know, the needs for a Davidson College are vastly different than what you might expect at UVA or Bernard College. Everyone's got a different scenario, different set of circumstances, and so planning for that requires individualization of your plans. Turning to where we're seeing the legal claims right now as it relates to employees. OSHA complaints are skyrocketing. OSHA has a general duties clause that requires all employers to provide a workplace that is free from recognized hazards that are causing or are likely to cause death or serious physical harm. Just since the COVID-19 outbreak, OSHA has received over 50,000 complaints. They have investigated over 3,000 of those complaints. They have 375, as of last week, 375 active investigations going on. The expectation is that we will continue to see a huge influx, especially as states are reopening and employees are coming back into the workplace. One other important point to make with regard to OSHA is that there is no specific COVID-19 guidance. There's no new standard that's been promulgated through OSHA. If you've seen in the news, there has been lawsuits brought by different labor unions against OSHA because the claim is that they failed to or neglected their duty to provide that guidance. But as of right now, there is no new standard of care from OSHA. The big area that we're seeing the lawsuits in right now also is tort-related claims. Tort claims, both from an individual and class basis, are being filed already. As I noted earlier, the numbers are skyrocketing as far as lawsuits that have been filed. As it relates to employees, a claim from an employee is likely to be barred by workers' comp or covered by the workers' comp scheme unless the employee can make an argument that the employer failed to exercise reasonable and due care, thereby creating an undue risk or harm. And in different states, the workers' comp exclusivity provision can be breached and a lawsuit can go forward in the courts. So I think it's important for everyone to understand in your individual state what the scope of the law is as it relates to workers' comp exclusivity. It's also important to note that a number of states have already enacted legislation or are considering legislation that creates a presumption that if an employee contracts COVID-19 and they were in the workplace within the last 14 days, that there is a presumption that they contracted COVID-19 in the workplace and that therefore their claim would be covered by workers' comp. Some of the claims that we expect to see as we move forward and as employers bring employees back to work. There is an expectation that we'll see retaliation and whistleblower claims go up, whether that is whistleblower claims related to complaints to OSHA, complaints just internally, or even National Labor Relations Act complaints because of engaging in protected concerted activity. The expectation, I think, certainly in the labor and employment community, is that those type of claims will skyrocket this fall as we see, this summer and fall, excuse me, as we see employees coming back into the workplace. Also, Americans with Disabilities Act claims are expected to rise. And this comes from both employees making claims that they were denied a reasonable accommodation, also claims for disclosure of confidential medical information. As you probably know, the ADA requires employers to engage in an interactive process if an employee makes a claim that he or she has a disability that needs to be accommodated. It is not clear, we have not seen any clear guidance, how the EEOC is going to deal with an employee who claims that they are in a heightened risk category for COVID-19, and for that reason, their accommodation is to remain home or work from home. But if employers do not engage in the interactive process and have a dialogue with employees, those claims will likely see success around the country. So as with any disability claim, the best advice is to make sure that you are engaging in the interactive process. Do not rely on a pat formulaic answer to employees who ask for or request leave accommodation, but make sure that you are looking at each of those individually and documenting the decisions that are made. We're also expecting to see an increase in just general discrimination claims rising out of COVID-19. Employees claiming that they were either denied an opportunity or either denied a job or denied an opportunity because of their age or because of a disability, which would put them in a heightened risk category. The thought here is that the claim will be that an employer, to avoid potential liability down the road, decided not to put these type of individuals that fall into those categories into the work environment and denied either a promotion or hiring to avoid that. The next area, which I think is really likely to see a significant uptick in litigation, is in the wage and hour space. The Fair Labor Standards Act and state wage and hour laws are already fodder for class actions, and there's a number of issues coming out of COVID-19, number of situations that employers are dealing with that are likely to lead to those increase in those claims. For example, an employee claiming that they were not paid while they waited in line to enter the work facility to have their temperatures taken or other screening that some employers contemplate doing. If an employee reports to work and is there ready, willing, and able to work and is not being paid, depending on your state wage and hour scheme, that may be compensable time. Also, if the employee is required to use their own face mask or other PPE, the cost for that, as well as the time it takes for cleaning that, may be compensable time. If they are required to purchase their own PPE, is that a reimbursable expense? Again, different states will have different treatment of how these issues play out, but it's important to keep them in mind as you move forward and bring employees back into the workplace. I want to spend a little bit of time here. This is my last slide, but I want to spend some time talking about kind of what you can do to prepare and put your organization or your institution in the best possible place to deal with these inevitable litigation claims. First, as I said at the beginning, you need to take all reasonable steps to comply with applicable current governmental guidance, whether it's coming from a state or federal or local health department, OSHA, the CDC, all are issuing guidance to deal with different issues in the workplace and in general. While it's not clear that that will become the standard of care, it is certainly a presumption that if you fail to comply with the recommended guidance from the CDC, for example, that will increase your potential for liability. Now, the CDC guidance, for those who have looked at it, and I'm going to assume that everyone on this webinar has probably looked at some CDC guidance. The CDC guidance is not definitive in most cases. There is a lot of wiggle room and recommendations, recognizing that it's hard to write a guidance that applies to everyone's specific situation. So there are going to be times when you are not able to. Either it's an impossibility based on the workplace, or based on the circumstances, or it's just a financial impossibility to do what's recommended. If that is the case, it is really important to document why you did not, or why you were not able to follow a set guidance. Also, document what the plan is for following those guidances. It should be well written in your safety plan and your return to operations plan. Third, communication is critical. Informing your employees, students, vendors, contractors, and visitors to your institutions is critical. Making sure that communication is clear, that there can be no misunderstanding of what is expected of each of these individuals while they are at your institution will be critical. A number of folks are looking towards statements, certainly for employees and for students, that would indicate that by coming to work or by coming or being engaged on campus, that they are acknowledging that they do not have any symptoms of COVID-19, that they do not have a temperature of over 100.4. So this idea that you put the onus on them, on the individual who is participating in the work or participating in the school, it is a good step. It is really not clear, I think, at this stage, how the courts will deal with that, but I think failing to do that is a huge mistake. Fourth, monitoring compliance. After putting these plans together, there needs to be a monitoring and enforcement of the steps taken. I don't think anyone can expect you're going to have 100% compliance. We've seen just the news coverage in the last weeks. People have different views of the risks and dangers of COVID-19, and that will make it hard to enforce these procedures. But institutions need to be vigilant in their attempts to monitor and ensure compliance. Lastly, kind of going back to my first comment as I started the legal issues section, is frequently review the guidance that's coming out of both state and federal agencies and adapt your policy as needed. Just this week alone, we've seen new guidance from CDC on how office buildings should operate. And if you followed the news earlier this week, there was guidance or confusion created with some changes that the CDC made about whether or not COVID-19 is transmittable on surfaces. There was great coverage that the CDC concluded that it was not likely to be transmitted on surfaces, and then just a few days later, they corrected that. That's not what their intent was, and they've corrected that guidance. So following and staying abreast of what is coming out from federal and state agencies and modifying your plan is absolutely critical. That's all I have, and I'm going to turn it over to Justin from BioIQ. Justin?
Thanks, John. This is Justin Belante. I'm the CEO of BioIQ. I'm joined by Debbie Dean. I'll take it from here. We're going to talk about returning to higher education strategies to deal with the COVID pandemic, or the disease in particular, within the community, campus, or population. the framework that I'm going to talk about in going back to school is very similar to the framework that's being applied across the country for various employers and various industries in either return to work scenarios or continued working scenarios. And the framework applies the basic protocol that you see on the left of your screen. This is the protocol that was really pioneered early in the pandemic by the South Korean government and shown to be effective at mitigating the risk and spread of the virus. And the protocol involves, one, symptom checking and exposure checking through questionnaires and physical symptom checking, then testing, then isolating individuals with symptoms or that test positive, and tracing, notifying people who may have been exposed to someone who tests positive. And while that's the basic protocol, and the goal of that protocol is really to understand risk across a population, to mitigate risk across a population, but also the protocol is meant to establish confidence amongst a student body or an employer group or a community, much like putting in place the TSA in a framework for security and surveillance after 9/11 allowed people to get back and travel and fly. This is the protocol that has largely been established in communities and workplaces to provide that confidence to go back to work. However, we also realize that this is not a one-size-fits-all protocol. You can't apply this exactly the same way in every campus or university or college setting. This protocol has to be tailored. And so as we go to the next slide, you'll see when we say tailoring the protocol, we really mean tailoring the intensity of the protocol across a population. And we leverage population segmentation, risk stratification, and targeting to do that. And one way of understanding that is if you look at the graph at the bottom and you think about how we would apply that protocol of checking for symptoms and testing individuals in a population. For example, if you were applying this to a healthcare worker going into a nursing home, you would apply a very tight protocol. That's a high intensity protocol where we would test that individual, whether they had symptoms or not, to see if they had the virus, probably every 2 or 3 days. In addition, every day we would be surveying and checking their symptoms. Now that's kind of a high intensity protocol, which would be different than, say, you were an employee, software developer at Facebook, and you're going from your home to an office setting, and in that office setting, you can social distance or physically distance, in which case that's a low risk scenario, and you probably wouldn't need baseline or frequent testing if you were asymptomatic. You would just get daily symptom checking and exposure checking, and if one of those triggered a flag, then you would get testing. So that's how we look at the application of the intensity of that protocol to different segments of a population. And if you look at how we would then treat an example of a university, we would look at different segments of a university population: students, student athletes, the staff at the university, professors, and even the healthcare or health staff at the university. We would treat those different. We would apply the protocol a little differently. And what we do is first segment those and see, what are the natural type of segments across that population. 2, we would look at what's the risk of those segments, or how would we score the risk. And so thinking about risk, we look at what's the business criticality. For example, if all the professors had COVID-19 or were infected, there would be high risk to the business to be able to carry on, or the same with the staff. So we look at business criticality. We also look at outcomes risk. Ultimately, what's the mortality rate? Some individuals or some groups of people are going to have more challenging outcomes or more risk than others. And then we'd also look at disease risk. And disease risk is really the risk of infection and transmission. And a big part of disease risk is just the community prevalence. And so, is the prevalence of the disease within the community, that region, or that area, or on campus, is it 5% versus 25%? That's a very different background prevalence. that would indicate someone's risk of getting the disease. And so we would score those different segments of the population, and then we would apply a protocol that's relevant to that scoring. So those who have low risk would probably have a low intensity protocol. So maybe low risk students would have a protocol where they would just go through a symptom questionnaire every day, and they would only get testing if they were symptomatic. Those at higher risk, for example, the health staff at a university or someone in the health center, they would be on a different protocol where they may, in addition to the daily symptom questionnaire, they may get regular testing. So that's an example of the application, kind of a non-one-size-fits-all, a tailored application of that protocol in a university setting. And really that allows you to be both more effective and cost-effective at the same time. And so if you look at the tools that we have in the protocol that we talked about, the tools are really symptom and exposure questionnaires that are done on a daily basis, testing, and then contact tracing. And what I wanted to focus a little bit of time talking about today is testing. One, because it's a critical component of the overall protocol, and two, because it's gotten so much national attention and it's such a moving target. And so when we look at the testing or testing that's applied, testing really goes into two buckets. It's testing for, do I have the virus or is somebody infected? And testing for, did I have the virus or was somebody exposed? And so the do I have the virus or the diagnostic testing is called RT-PCR testing. And this is the kind of gold standard testing from the CDC and FDA, where someone collects a sample and then you're looking directly for the presence of the DNA or RNA in that sample. And if the virus is present in that sample, you can assume it's present in that individual that the sample was collected from, and therefore they have the virus. The second type of testing, which has been in the news much more recently, especially over the last couple of weeks, is antibody testing, which means were you exposed to the virus, and as a result, has your body produced antibodies to fight the virus? And so, again, a different test that's looking at seeing if antibodies are present in your body. And, really we look at that as a test for exposure. There's a lot of debate and information out there about immunity, and do you have enough antibodies, or at what point do you develop antibodies, or can antibodies produce immunity? I think that's something that the global scientific community is still actively researching, and probably we're learning more about that on a daily basis and weekly basis. So we'll continue to learn more about immunity as a subject, but antibody testing in general is really a look at exposure. And one great function around antibody testing is that when you're thinking about exposure or testing for exposure, that means it could be a very effective test for, as individuals come on campus, doing antibody testing to understand, is the overall prevalence of the disease on campus increasing over time? Is the prevalence higher or lower? So there are very, very practical functions for antibody testing. However, most of the testing involved in the specific protocol that we talked about are really if individuals have symptoms, then you want to test them to confirm whether or not they do have it, and that's diagnostic testing from an RT-PCR perspective. So I will hand it off from there.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Doug Gwynn. I'm the Vice President of Projects and Specialty Services with Thompson Industrial Services. Sincerely appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk about this with the group today. I'm going to cover a number of different things on the considerations that you need to have as you go through the reopening and the continual operation of your schools and universities when it comes to your cleaning and disinfecting operations. So some of the topics I'll cover, number one is what you need to do to go about making that plan, how to take into account whether you have a known or positive case versus if you're doing just preventive or routine disinfecting, what kind of equipment you'll need to take a look at purchasing or contracting, and then procedures and training around getting personnel up to speed and all of the tasks that go along with the disinfecting services. So the first thing that I'll echo what was said earlier is the CDC is a great resource for you to go and gather a lot of information for the most current guidances and recommendations. It is constantly changing. It's very easy to navigate. There's a great section on schools and universities, and then other things on specific cleaning and disinfecting plans that you can go to. The link that is on this slide actually goes to the decision tool, a document for helping you put your plan together on the different aspects that you need to think about when you talk about cleaning and disinfecting. So this is an example of one of those slides, and I separate the terms cleaning and disinfecting to where disinfecting is truly using an EPA registered chemical that has been approved for use in killing the coronavirus. Versus cleaning is your normal routine soap and water type of a thing, which still is the right thing to do from an industrial hygiene standpoint and from a daily maintenance standpoint. But this flow chart gives you the considerations that you need to take into account, whether you're going to put in a disinfecting plan or just a cleaning plan. So some of those questions that it takes into consideration: is it an indoor area or an outdoor area? How often is the area inhabited? Has somebody been in that area within the last 7 days? Are there a lot of surfaces in the area that are frequently touched that could lead to those the surface contamination? And as also was mentioned before, there's been multiple different guidances that have come out just this week on the transmission through touchable surfaces like that, and our recommendation still is to treat a touchable surface as something that you need to go through with your normal disinfecting plan, and assume that you would have a positive if you're in a known positive environment, that a touchable surface could transmit the virus. And then again, the very last talks about on this slide, goes through the considerations that you make if it is a hard surface or a soft surface such as carpeting, rugs, those type of things. A lot of different considerations need to be made whether you are in a known or suspected case or whether you're just putting together your routine and preventive plans. So starting with the known and suspected case, the most important thing is you need to treat everything that somebody is going to come in contact with as if it is contaminated. Just like the universal control with bloodborne pathogen training, it will be the same thing for this with a known or suspected case. This increases the type of PPE that you are going to use. We recommend a polycoated chemical suit rather than just a standard Tyvek suit, because standard white Tyvek can be porous. So you want something that is polycoated that prevents anything from permeating that. We recommend full face respirators with either a P100 and or a multi-gas cartridge, depending on the type of chemical that you're using, and nitrile or medical gloves. After you are done disinfecting an area with a known or suspected case, you do have to go through a full decontamination before you remove your clothing. That means being sprayed down with another disinfectant to get any remnants off of the clothing, having somebody that is in a clean area to help with that, and then all of the PPE and the waste items, such as the rags that you use, they need to be disposed of and treated as hazardous medical waste for their disposal. Contrasting that to a routine or preventive, the first thing that you want to do is, as you go through something, is develop that detailed list of items that you want to have disinfected for every area. Make sure that you have a checklist as you're going through, that every possible touchable surface in every area is covered as a part of that plan. Determine the proper frequency with that. If it is a high contact area or crowded areas where there are people a lot, such as dormitories, common areas, cafeterias, it's something that you definitely want to do daily, versus if it's something that doesn't have people there all of the time, weekly is going to be more appropriate for that. For PPE on routine and preventive, you can use more standard PPE, street clothes or a general Tyvek suit with that. a standard K95 mask with nitrile gloves as well. Whatever you choose, make sure that the disinfecting agent that you're using, that the PPE is compatible with that. Always consult the safety data sheet before you choose and finalize on what PPE you are planning to utilize. Normal waste can be on routine preventive can be handled just as you would any standard garbage or waste disposal. And again, a routine and preventive service really does send a positive message to your students and staff and any visitors that you may have on campus that you are doing the right thing, that you're concerned about their health and safety above all else when you put in these routine and preventive plans. I do want to highlight as well that anybody that goes through and does corona disinfecting, whether it's known or suspected or if it's a routine, really does have to go through an infection prevention training protocol before they begin anything so that they are 100% sure that they are having themselves protected as well and doing all the right things during the disinfecting services to keep everybody safe that will inhabit the area after they leave. For the equipment that you can utilize for the disinfecting, there's really two main types. The first is a fogger or a mister. This is the most effective in terms of the time that you're going to spend and getting the deep coverage. Very time effective solution, but it does have a medium to large upfront cost. You are going to have to buy some equipment in order to do this. Typically in foggers and misters, you use a quaternary ammonium for the main disinfecting agent. These can be electrostatically charged or just standard. Very typical type of a fogger is what you would see with a pest control type of an application. The problem that you will find, though, is because of the large demand, those can have a long lead time right now and be a little bit more difficult to find. So even a standard paint sprayer that you can buy at your local big box store, if you put the right tubing and the right tips on that, can create a fog and mist rather than a liquid stream. The positive thing about this fogging is it is suitable around most electronics. So computer labs will be an acceptable place where you can use fogging. It's very good for smaller areas that have a lot of contact surfaces. So classrooms, so all of those desk surfaces can get cleaned very quickly with that fogger. And you can usually get back into those areas within an hour after the cleaning. And that isn't because of any safety reason around the chemical. That's really for the odor consideration. The better ventilation that you have in an area where you're fogging, the faster that it's going to get cleared and the more quickly people can return to it. Second option is a standard liquid sprayer like a pump-up sprayer or just a standard Clorox type spray bottle. The lower cost option, we recommend a 2% bleach solution. That's also the CDC guidelines for this type of a service. This is really suitable for large areas that might have few touchable surfaces where you may not want to spend the time and effort for a full fogging, but you still want to handle some other small pieces of equipment in there. One example might be a dorm hallway where you have a lot of handles that are always constantly being touched by people. You might not want to spend the time fogging, but you can use a wipe down for the door handles. The liquid must remain in contact with the surface for a minimum of 10 minutes before you wipe it off. One downside is you cannot spray it directly onto electronics. You will have to spray it onto a cloth, wipe those down manually as per the manufacturer's guidelines. And areas can be cleaned usually with personnel there. So this is something that can be done without having to evacuate that room. Finally, and some of this is repetitive, but just to bring everything back for all of the procedures and the training that you'll want to take into account as you put your plan in place. Again, all personnel that are performing these services need to have specific infection prevention training. You need to consider the type of chemical that you're purchasing. It's not just as simple as putting a plan in place and putting the cleaning procedures in place. You're going to have chemical makeup procedures that are going to be involved with it as well. So again, consult that safety data sheet, consult the EPA website for the list of approved chemicals. Make sure your proper PPE is in place based on the chemical manufacturer recommendation and whether it's a preventive service versus a known positive situation. Always have a detailed checklist for the area and specific items to be cleaned. In terms of food considerations, so most chemicals that are on that EPA approved list are able to come in contact with food, contact, or preparation surfaces and tools without needing a post-rinse, but obviously they cannot come in direct contact with a food item. A quaternary ammonia is what is used in food processing plants primarily for their shift-to-shift disinfection. And then finally, take into consideration what you have to do with waste disposal. If you have to handle it as a medical hazardous waste, or if you can simply dispose of it under your normal sanitation procedures. With that, I'll hand it back over to Harrison for the Q&A.
Thanks, everybody. Good presentations. We have used most of our time, but we will have time for a couple of questions. The most common question that you've submitted has been, will the slides be available? And the answer is yes. Within a day or two, this recording and the slides will be available on the McGuire-Woods website. One of the questions that we've been asked is testing capacity available? Justin, you talked about regular testing, a lot in the media about that. Will it be available in the fall?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'd say the answer is absolutely yes. I think much more testing capacity is on the market today than it was 2 months ago. Obviously, that was a real challenge then, and more testing capacity is coming to market. I'd say the other thing that we've done, particularly across our lab networks and generally the country has done, which is diversify supply chains. So being able to complete testing using a nostril swab versus a deep nasal swab versus a saliva sample, varying the sample types has helped a lot as well as far as freeing up the supply chain and bringing more both sample collection capacity as well as laboratory testing capacity to bear.
And how quickly are the test results available?
Most labs are turning their sample processing around in 24 to 48 hours. Again, that was a real struggle early on in the first month or two where your larger national labs were having a real hard time with turnaround times. But now, kind of leveraging that diversified lab network and supply chain, 24 to 48 is standard.
Good. Doug, a couple of questions on how effective the cleaning is on surfaces that are touched regularly. I'm thinking of door handles. Is there a cleaning system that eliminates the need to clean between every human being that goes through a door?
The recommendation is that for most of the EPA chemicals, is a 24-hour life after that disinfecting, that if somebody does come into contact with it within 24 hours, should, and I emphasize the word should, be safe, but after 24 hours, if somebody that is contaminated comes into contact, then that would require another disinfecting, and that's why the guidance is daily for a lot of those high contact areas.
Thank you. John McDonald, with age being a risk factor, is it possible to develop an increased intensity screening protocol for employees based on age without that being found to be discriminatory?
Harrison, I think that's a really tough one. Anytime you're using a protected category as a way you're going to delineate or treat people differently, you run the risk that will be used against you as proof of discrimination. There were a number of cases years ago, and some people on this call may remember, an employer decided to keep certain people, pregnant women, away from a certain situation because of risk to the fetus. That was found to be discriminatory. So developing something that uses only one category is going to increase your risk for liability. I think there are ways you can do this without, if you have a protocol that looks at all risk factors, not just age, I think that helps and doesn't target anybody, because the risk factors, if we look at the CDC guidelines, it's anyone who's got immunocompromised or other health condition, So age is not an indicator there. So if you have a protocol that uses and contemplates all of these things, you have a better chance. But even then, the claim could be that you're discriminating against somebody who's got a disability. It's what you do with it. And under the ADA, as I said earlier, it really comes down to the interactive process. If the employee wants that protection, you're not going to have a problem. The problem is if you are then keeping them out because you're trying to avoid future liability. That's where the problem is created.
Well, thanks to all of our presenters, and thank you, the audience. We have a huge crowd that signed up today. We're glad that you're here. We've gotten lots of questions that we haven't had a time to answer. We will be assigning them to a presenter who will be getting back with you. Thanks for all that you are doing to keep our schools safe. If you have further questions, please feel free to reach out to any of us. Be careful out there. Thank you. This concludes our presentation.